All right. See, there is always a way around. So, okay. Again, just everybody in the audience, please keep your camera off. If it's popping on, we'll probably turn it off for you, just to keep everything focused here with us and our host, our guests. So today we have got Jeff and Cathy, who are returning. Welcome. How are you guys doing?
We're doing great.
We're
Thanks
great.
for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us back.
Oh, we love having you guys. You guys are always great. I think the last time you were on, I missed you. I was on a business trip or something and just didn't get a chance to log in. So super happy to have you and be able to talk with you guys again. So Jeff and Cathy, for those who don't know, have recently written a book, which has been fantastic. I think you guys have been making your rounds on the speaking circuit and talking about it. There you go. Intentional courtship. Well, all right. So tell us a little bit about each of you. I know you guys, we've heard your story before here on the podcast, but we always have new people joining us. So tell us a little bit about each of you, what you currently do for work, how long you guys have been together, all those little details, and then we'll kind of get into the meat and potatoes of our discussion tonight. But let's start with you guys. Let's get to know you a little bit. Ladies first, Cathy.
Oh,
Thank you.
We'll go that route. Yes, there you go.
All right. So I am a Suzuki violin teacher. I'm also a professional wedding crasher. I play in a
Nice.
string quartet, and so I get to go to weddings of perfect strangers. Sometimes I sit closer to the bride and groom than their own parents, which is like really kind of fun. But yeah, I've seen lots of weddings over the last 20 years along the Wasatch Front.
And I am, in my day job, an assistant attorney general with the state of Utah, and I'm in the Constitutional Defense and Special Litigation Division. So I defend the state's laws when they're challenged as being unconstitutional. I advise the governor and the attorney general on constitutional law issues and sometimes the legislature. So have a lot of fun doing that. And of course, with Cathy, I started Love in Later Years and wrote the book that you mentioned. We've been together for 4 years, well, 4.5, have been married that amount of time. And then we met in 2016, early 2016. So we've known each other 6.5 years.
Fantastic.
We dated a good chunk of 2016. Then we broke up at the end of the year. And we were just friends throughout 2017. And then 2018 dawned and we decided to get back together and date for marriage and got married in May of that year. That's the cliff notes.
All right.
That's the shortened version, huh? Fantastic. Well, a lot of people in the audience may know you guys from the group Lily, or the acronym Lily, Love in Later Years.
Yes.
And that is the book that you guys have written. You guys have been around on a lot of the podcasts, a lot of the different shows, and talking about this book. But most importantly, I really like when we had talked before about the reasonings, and maybe we can touch on this just really briefly before we get into the topic today, which is how much should we heal before dating? But why? Tell us a little bit about why you felt this need to write this book. Just again, the Cliff Notes version. I know we've gone over a whole podcast discussing this before, but tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind it, because I think it's a fascinating story.
Well, the story of how it got started is I started writing it like 7 years ago or something.
Well, he was still dating.
While I was still single, and I wrote a few chapters and then kind of figured out that I wasn't ready, that I was still grieving and still kind of in that space where I needed to do some more healing before I was really ready to complete the book. And then one night after Cathy and I had been married a couple of years, I couldn't sleep, and I went downstairs to my office, and it seemed a little heavy to be working on legal work at that point. And so I just started browsing through my computer, and I remembered that then that I had started that book, and I read what I had written so far, and I added some stuff to each of those chapters. And the next morning I told Cathy, there was this book I started writing years ago that I never finished, and I read some of it and I think it has possibilities. And her immediate response was, I want in. And so after that, we wrote it together. And I always say, in our relationship, she's the anchor and I'm the sail. So I was kind of the creative force that got the thing going, but Cathy is the follow through and finisher, organizer kind of person. And so our two different personalities kind of works together to bring the book about.
Yeah, and that's true on our YouTube channel and our podcast. I want the outlines, I want it organized, I want to know what our subjects are. And he's like, let's just go talk.
Right. Yeah, you guys are more like Jeff. I think you're the sail, and Cathy's probably the rudder that kind of steers the ship where it really needs to go, right? So, and one thing that I did forget to do before we get started here, too deep into this, I forgot to announce everybody. So Jeff and Cathy, you guys obviously we've announced John and Celeste are our other hosts here with us tonight. Dr. John Brailsford, psychologist, and Celeste, dating life coach. And tonight we'll all be discussing this. So definitely love the article. We'll get some insights from John and Celeste, and then I'll throw in my 2 cents every now and then, but we'll let the pros speak more than me. So love your guys's drive on this. And I think it's super healthy. Again, our topic tonight is how much should we heal before dating? And I think this is a huge topic that we've come across many, many, many times. I know John has spoken about it at length. And, there's a lot of people, especially when you go through that initial breakup, that sort of feel like this void or this hole in their life that's just not there anymore. And immediately there kind of tends to be this propensity to want to fill that void, right? And just, gosh, I need to find somebody. I need to jump on board. I need to get this fixed because I don't like how this feels. I don't like being alone, or maybe I just want to be alone for a while. But really, in order to get back into that healthy relationship state again, there's probably going to be some healing that needs to be done. And we've talked about that a lot here on the show, but I really like the article. So Jeff, maybe tell us a little bit about this article that you wrote. What kind of prompted you specifically towards this subject?
Which article are we talking about?
How much should we heal before dating?
Yeah, the one you just wrote on the 13th about how long should we heal before dating?
Oh, yeah. Well, the thing that prompted that is we've preached this idea that you need to take some time to heal before you start dating. And we think sometimes maybe we've overdone that because it can be sort of a convenient excuse, even to yourself, not to put yourself out there, just saying, well, I'm working on me right now. And while we're all for working on yourself, there is a limit to how far you can go that way, I think. And so we kind of decided on that article because it suggests we need a balance. We think on one hand, and we sort of got this idea from Dr. Greg Bear, that once you no longer need to be in a relationship, then you're ready. And if you're desperately feeling a need to be in a relationship, you're probably not ready. And that's sort of a paradox. But anyway, if you're comfortable as an independent individual, I think that's an important criteria for when you should start dating. And then I think there's a recognition that we're all a work in progress. I mean, I haven't totally fully healed from my past traumas yet. And I think Cathy would say the same thing. And some of that healing could only take place within a relationship. Because a lot of, I mean, I felt a lot more healed at certain times when I was single because I didn't have Julia, my former wife, there to trigger me. And you know, it's not that Cathy triggers me constantly. Maybe she did it when we were first married. I don't
Only every other day, right? So,
but well, actually, I can honestly say there's no one in the world I trust more than her. And that wasn't always true. I mean, I had a hard time believing in it at first when we first got married. I wanted to believe in it. I believed in it as much as I could sort of believe in anything else, but I had a hard time trusting that it was real because I had had so many years and other relationships that didn't turn out to be real.
absolutely. You know, it's interesting when we get into these situations where you had mentioned before, when you feel like you don't need to be into a relationship, that's when you kind of feel like you're ready. I think there's a little bit of a double-edged sword, and maybe John can speak to this as well a little bit. I kind of find it that for myself, especially when I felt like I don't really need to be in a relationship, that's when I get comfortable and maybe almost a little lazy, like, being a bachelor can be a wonderful thing sometimes, right? Like, I don't have anybody to tell me what to do. I can just come home. I've got the house to myself. I can just sort of do whatever it is I want to do. I can think around projects in the garage. I can just sort of watch whatever I want to watch on TV. All of those things are just up for me to do, which, while it seems nice, it's definitely not a healthy thing to do. So yeah, John, at what point do you think you kind of reach that equilibrium where it's like, all right, it's good to be?
It could be anywhere on the dial. Like, I mean, and I've been struck lately because I agree that I think there's two processes involved. One is healing and one is dating. And I do think they kind of overlap, you know, a little bit. But I would say if the healing is complete, I don't know that we need as much dating. If the healing is incomplete, we need a lot of dating, you know, and so on. Just lately, I've actually been struck. I don't know that, I mean, these people surround me. There are people in my ward, there are people in my family, there are people, all kinds of people. And what they all have in common, I'm talking about 6 couples. They're all blissfully married. And they were all married in less than 2 months from first date. Now, I don't recommend that, but let me tell you what they all have in common that I think made it work, even though they had only known each other a short time. They were all incredibly healed. They were all in such good places. Now, some of them were young when they did this, and some were old. Like one is my mother. She remarried, but after a decade after my dad died. And I mean, a guy showed up. He's a former stake president, patriarch. He showed up at a singles conference where she was teaching. He came to look for a wife. He felt like the Lord wanted him to go to this conference, and he showed up, and 2 weeks later they were engaged, and a month after that they were married. They are the cutest couple I've ever seen. They adore each other. They are literally in love every day. And it's been 5 years since they were married, and not a day goes by when they haven't really, they've disagreed on a couple of things, but they really haven't had a bad day. And so you ask yourself, man, what are they drinking? You know, I think the key with both of them was they were healed. So he was a widower and she was a widow, but they had healed from the trauma of losing a spouse, to the point where they felt like I can be guided by the spirit now, not by anything else inside me, natural man, natural woman stuff. So where are we at? And I think with some of our divorces and the trauma we've been through, I don't know that we can do that even after 10 years. I would say that in their case and in the other cases that I'm talking about, they had all been through some hard times, you know, these couples that I'm talking about, but like Jeff and Cathy said, I think there comes a time where you've done all the healing you can do alone. And now's the time where you need to heal together. And
Absolutely.
yeah, it's hard to say when that time is right, but that's where I say you have to know yourself. You have to know where they have to know themselves, and you have to know the Lord and let him kind of, but I would say the Lord can make up the difference. He can really give you courage to go in when it seems too early, or he can give you the courage to hold off when you feel like you've already waited long enough. The key is he knows what we need. So
That's right.
Well, that kind of raises two issues or thoughts that I'd like to throw out there. One is, you may not be ready to date seriously right after getting a divorce or going through a traumatic breakup or whatever. But what I tried to do, I mean, when I met Cathy, I had only been divorced a couple of months. And as some of you know, I was divorced twice, and that was from my second wife. But so I met her, and I thought she was great. And I said, we went on a date, and I said, I've just barely got divorced for the second time. I'm couch surfing at my parents' house because I just lost my corporate job, was laid off. And basically I'm unemployed, but I'm starting a business. I'm working on getting things going in my life. And you think, wow, that's a lot to lay on somebody on a first date. But the reason I told her that was, I just said, look, I'm not saying nothing can happen between us, but if it does, it's going to take some time. And it did. It took 2 years. And we dated other people in the meantime, and so on. But I had healing to do. She had healing to do. She was pretty fresh off of a divorce as well. And so that's one thing. I think we sometimes think, well, before I even go on a date with anybody, I've got to be completely healed. And maybe part of the way you heal is, getting out of your house and going and socializing and meeting people. And as long as you're honest and upfront about the fact that, hey, I'm still in healing mode, whatever develops is going to take some time, I think that's perfectly fine. The other thing is, there's a story that's in Intentional Courtship, our book, which I have told in a number of settings, but Cathy and I early on we only saw each other on the weekends when she didn't have her kids. And she lived an hour away from me. And so there was this weekend when she had her kids, but I was going to be in her town for something else that Saturday. And so I got in town on Friday and stayed at my brother's house. And I let Cathy know that I was in town, and she said, oh, come over. So I came over. That was unexpected. We were going to get breakfast the next morning, but we hadn't talked about Friday night. And so I spent 5 hours with her. I met her kids for the first time. We had a great evening together. But as I'm leaving her house at midnight or 1 a.m. to go over to my brother's, Cathy said, well, we better cancel tomorrow morning because I don't want to be up late while, when I have my kids tomorrow. I don't want to be up late and then get up early when I have my kids tomorrow. Well, perfectly reasonable thing to do, right? Perfectly reasonable decision. I was completely triggered. Like, it felt like rejection because I had issues from rejection in my first marriage. And anyway, I spent probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the way to my brother's house thinking about how to break up with her. And then I get, almost there, and it sort of dawns on me, wait a minute. I just spent 5 hours with her, and I met her kids for the first time. That is not rejection. That is a step forward. And as soon as that dawned on me, I was like, oh, okay. I feel instantly better. Well, then the next day she invited me to go out to a church meeting, which I did, and we got dinner before, and that was nice. And so the next day it's Sunday, and I was sitting in church, and I texted Cathy, how about let's plan something next weekend? And she said, sure, that sounds great, but I've got a sister coming into town from New York and I don't see her that much. And so I'll have to get back to you after I've talked to her about her schedule. And instantly I'm triggered again, and I'm thinking, kind of like that, that movie, Can't Buy Me Love. I'll be washing my hair out of the country.
Yeah, he actually questioned if I even had a sister.
Right. I wondered if there even really was a sister.
He thought she was just blowing you off with cheesy
Yeah,
excuses.
just be real with me. Just be real with me, girl.
Right.
And anyway, again, after a little bit of wrestling with that, it dawned on me, okay, wait a minute. We just spent 2 evenings together on a weekend when she had her kids. This is not rejection. And turned out I went and saw my therapist on Monday, and I told her about this whole experience. And she said, her immediate response, I'll never forget it, was, seems real, feels real, it's very powerful, and it's probably lying to you. And she talked to me about cognitive distortions. And the thing is, for most of us who are divorced or widowed or have been through other traumas, we have some trauma. And when we get, poked in a sensitive area, so to speak, we tend to have a distorted view of things that can horribilize and make things a lot worse than they really are. And so that's one of the reasons I think we need to focus on healing, because those sort of automatic feelings we can have that come up when we get triggered, they can really, with healthy relationships. What if I had gone through with breaking up with Cathy? We probably wouldn't be sitting here. And I shudder to think how close I came to actually doing that. So
yeah, so we have to balance, so what John, I just saw John's comment, and I've also seen other comments coming in that sometimes we can overthink, sometimes we can rush in. So it's like we have to balance our healthy skepticism with the reality that we're probably more likely to give into fear than to, I don't know. It really depends. Cause I've done both. I've jumped in too fast and ended up in a second marriage that didn't work. I also went the other extreme afterwards where I dated everyone under the sun. I was really afraid to jump into any relationship. Even after a long time of getting to know someone. In fact, I think I was even kind of on the path of, I want to be with someone that's cool and nice to be with, but I don't have a future with, because anything more than that scares me. And I didn't even know that I needed to heal that part of myself until I was dating, and I could evaluate, oh, I'm not really acting in my best interest here. This is not congruent with what I want most.
Yeah, so Cathy has sometimes, I was just going to add that Cathy has sometimes said that she dated men that she knew there was no future with because that felt safer.
Well, it is safer, right? Because then there's no future. You don't have to worry about that.
Right.
But here's my question. So I know we're talking about balance, and I know we're talking about, going too fast, going too slow, all that. But I wonder if we can kind of focus on, how do we find that balance? What is it that we have to say to ourselves, or what is it that we have to consider to find the balance? Because I think some people are like, I don't know if I'm going too fast. I don't know if I'm going too slow. I'm kind of scared. I'm kind of nervous. So where do we find that balance, or how can they look at their life or look at themselves and figure out what is balanced versus being to one way or the other?
So maybe we could discuss some of the questions that you had, and maybe even some of the questions I came up with as I was answering those questions, with what I thought we might. Anyway, I think the first thing I want to say is, in our book, Intentional Courtship, the first 8 chapters ended up being about healing, about finding peace. And the other 12 chapters are about dating and relationship development, and knowing what you're looking for in a companion, being really clear about that so that you are being intentional along your path and your journey. And then along the way, we give all the ways in which we didn't do it so great, so people could learn from our mistakes and also from our triumphs. But I think, it's interesting, because I don't think any book on dating would be complete without healing. It wouldn't. And I don't think any dating journey would be complete without intention. So I guess here's what, because you said essential healing in the title, essential healing for dating and success. Mm-hmm. And the answers that I came to with this, what is most important for essential healing? Radical acceptance of your loss, whatever your loss is. Letting go to make room for compassion and understanding of yourself and your former partner. And that's kind of all one thing, radical acceptance. Because if you're fighting against the reality that you're no longer in a marriage or in a partnership that you thought you'd be in forever, you're probably not ready to date.
If I could just add to that too, I think that radical acceptance doesn't necessarily mean you like what happened. And sometimes I think releasing that trauma literally means talking to anyone and everyone. I don't literally mean anyone and everyone, but I know that I had to widen my circle to old friends, missionary companions, and so on. And some of those people I hadn't talked to in 15, 20 years. And thankfully, they were all to a person so loving and supportive, and they listened to me tell the same stories over and over again. And I think
can any of you relate with this?
Oh yeah, 100%. Yep.
I think it was necessary for me to do that for a while to sort of release that trauma. Now, I think it's a very easy place to get stuck, and that's where the balance you're talking about comes in. Mm-hmm. So part of it is radical acceptance, and part of it is grieving the loss. And I think part of that may mean talking to other people.
Until you're so sick of hearing it, you're done.
Right.
Or you're at least like backing off.
Well,
right.
And Eric, I think it was Eric or Syra that just made a comment that sometimes seeing the other person's perspective can be helpful, which I totally agree with. But I think before you can get there, you have to sort of process the pain you feel. And then you can start to see, okay, there were elements in the way that I behaved in that previous relationship that were unhealthy.
And of course, we advise that in the book and in our coaching, but when I have coaching clients who've just broken up with someone and they're really devastated and heartbroken, I always suggest to be really gentle with yourself and to do a lot of self-care and wait to do the hard, like self-evaluating until you've done whatever grieving is necessary, until you feel like you're in a little better place.
And to just point out, because we do this quite a bit, sometimes the self-eval, it could just very well be, maybe I should have left sooner, or maybe I shouldn't have, allowed someone to treat me that way, because there are victims and we don't want them to feel like they had any right or part in being victimized, but maybe they had a chance to move on sooner and they opted out. But I think it's important to find where we could have done things differently, because that helps us know, first of all, the type of person we want to be in the future and the type of person we want to attract.
Yes, and compassion always has to come with the self-evaluation, always, because otherwise we get stuck in shame and frustration rather than being able to actually change something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask a question. I'm going to kind of play devil's advocate here for just a minute. Let's say I'm going to look at this at kind of both perspectives. Let's say I'm someone who feels like I've healed a lot and I'm ready to date. Like I feel like I'm comfortable either way, but I could go out and date. And then I find somebody that is like, okay, they're on their journey still, obviously. They're still wanting to talk about their traumas a lot. At what point do you kind of look at that and say, okay, maybe I should give this a chance, or maybe I should just say, this person has a ways to go. We're not on the same plane. I need to like go do my own thing. Where do you figure out that difference?
Well, I think if you're ready, but they're not, you can consider it an evening of, I'm going to be their friend, and I'm going to not go on a date with them again,
If you're a girl, it's a free meal, right?
Oh my God.
Is that how it goes?
No.
I believe in being Christ-like in the dating process and what I mean by that is, okay, give them the same compassion you would want if you were in that position or if you were still in that place. But that doesn't mean you need to continue dating them.
Right.
But I think, there's never a wasted date if we approach dating that way.
And there's also, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well,
I was just gonna say that there's also the thought of if the other person is healing and you can recognize that, you have to kind of self-evaluate, am I willing to wait? If the person, if it feels good to me, and obviously we want to pray and find direction that way, but if we're willing to wait while the person heals, that is an option, but we have to probably reevaluate along the process, because it might take years and years and maybe we're not willing to do that. But just because someone's healing, we probably shouldn't just opt out unless we're just not in a place to have the willingness to wait, or we don't have the time or the emotional stamina to deal with it.
And that's where friendship, for a while, if you're still both available and they're in a better place, you can start dating again later on.
Which is what we did. But I think now if I'm in a person that's in that space where I literally can't get through a conversation without it ultimately everything coming back to my divorce or whatever, then that may not be the best place from which to start anything serious. I have wanted to be there for people going through that who I know, where I know that people were there that way for me. But it doesn't necessarily mean dating them, like Cathy said. It might just mean being a shoulder to cry on or a good friend.
Yeah.
Did we answer your devil's advocate question, Everett?
Yeah. The reason I bring that up is because I think it's fascinating. That's sort of the situation that you guys found yourself in, right? Like Jeff's still processing this. He's going through, he's talking about this a lot. And I can only imagine, Cathy, you're sitting there at some point going, dude, all right. Maybe.
Well, she had just as many fears and
beyond.
traumas as I did.
Oh, yeah. In fact, we kind of had different ways in which we weren't ready. But yes, in ways that I was ready and he wasn't, I was like, oh, brother, oh no.
Right.
Oh,
Even opposite sensitivities.
Yeah.
Like I was sensitive to rejection. She was sensitive to commitment.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I can get trapped by a commitment. Oh, I can be alone through rejection, and
What's interesting with that? I think that Heavenly Father is really clever. I don't doubt that he doesn't connect people with opposites so that they can then help each other heal those areas. And this is why I'm really a big advocate for saying that I don't think you have to be fully healed to date and get into a relationship. I think some aspects of ourselves can't necessarily be fully healed unless we have our other half, right? Because we come one and we can help each other heal. And it's funny that y'all were just opposite and could help each other heal your opposite areas. And I don't think that's an accident. I think the Lord has a way of knowing that if you guys both had the same struggles across the board, then there'd be no support for each other. There'd be no way to help each other. And I think sometimes he brings together people that do have opposing struggles so that they can become one through the process.
Oh, yeah. And, Heidi just asked a question and I'll just answer it really quick. she asked if we have like anxious avoidant attachment going on in our relationship. And this is where like it was such a blessing to write Intentional Courtship, because we got a lot more clear about the agreements we would have in our marriage. And I tend to avoid conflict when I am not in a good enough place to be able to discuss it. And I actually think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And then Jeff really wants to work things out because he wants to become close again when we're at odds. And there's a lot of wisdom in that. But as you said, that's kind of opposing, right? So our agreement is that at any time when we are feeling emotionally flooded, we can call a timeout in our marriage. And it's really, I think this is like the best divorce proofing there is. And that is the safety to call an emotional timeout, to go and self-soothe and give yourself grace and get yourself back to a better place so that you can actually come back together and talk about it reasonably. And we've found that if we do that, instead of fighting all night long,
Which we could do.
Yep.
we resolve it in 5 to 10 minutes. We
Right.
say a prayer, we resolve it in 5 to 10 minutes, because we're responsible for our own emotional well-being. And we go and we give ourselves that time out, and then we come back together and we're just so much better for it. So much better. And he knows we're going to work things out. And I know I can have space when I need it.
And that just shows that you're taking accountability for your own triggers, because it's not the other person's fault that you have a trigger from past trauma. And I love
Right.
that. I love that.
And
I think
half of the battle there is understanding that we have those triggers, that we have those traumas, that it's not the other person doing it to us.
right.
And once we understand that, I think even if we're triggered and we're feeling all these things, well, we tell our kids all the time, don't we? When you're offered drugs, know what you're going to say well in advance, so that when you're in the heat of the moment, your response is automatic. We've got to do that in handling our emotional trauma as adults, so that, because you don't think well in a moment when you're triggered. So if you have a process that sort of kicks in automatically when that situation arises, you can handle it with intention instead of emotion.
And if you're Christ-like in your dating patterns, you're more likely to be Christ-like in your marriage, and be able to come to a person who is your spouse, who's experiencing a little trauma, and know that although you're not responsible for it, you have a big impact on how that trauma either heals or continues to fester, right? So like one time, like Jeff did something that triggered some transference in me, some like, okay, I've experienced a lot of trauma in the past over this, and I knew it wasn't him, and I knew it wasn't like me choosing it, but I was feeling the trauma in my body. And he just came up and gave me a big hug, and he said, "What are you scared of? Honey, I love you." Like, and that was so healing for me, like to have him care about the trigger, knowing it wasn't his, knowing, and knowing that I wasn't blaming him for it, but knowing that it was coming up.
And that's a part of healing that you don't get when you're single and alone in a house, and it's not something your 5-year-old or 12-year-old child can necessarily give you, even though they can comfort you for sure. And that means something, and it means a lot, but there's just something about, having a partner in your life who's the one offering that comfort, especially when they're like the person that hurt you.
Yep.
Right.
It's like a man hurt me, but this man's holding me while I experience this. That woman hurt me, but now she's the one comforting me when I'm struggling.
Yeah.
And
Well,
that's like double, triple the healing impact of anyone else doing it.
Well, and when we interviewed Dr. Jennifer Finlayson Fife on our podcast, and it's an awesome episode. I believe it's called Wisdom for Mid-Singles, and it's episode 24 on LilyPod, if anyone wants to check it out. But she said the number one quality she would suggest every single adult look for in a partner,
Look for and develop
in themselves,
in themselves.
is someone who can see themselves, someone who can self-evaluate and be willing and able to grow and change. And I think we live in a gospel that believes in eternal progression. So for me, personal growth isn't something that just happens while we're trying to heal, but it's continual. It's something you continue to do with your partner too. If you're both on that same page, you're growing together rather than potentially growing apart in different directions. Like, does that make sense?
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Well, I think it's also important to remember too that in this life we're never going to be truly fully healed, and so we're all on a journey. We don't cross any finish line in this life where we've just arrived and everything is better and we're perfect, right?
Yeah.
So along that path, we just need to find the things that are going to be, like you've talked about, the triggers. We need to understand ourselves. And John, correct me if I'm wrong, but I sort of believe that if we are, I mean, I'm kind of putting myself back in somebody who's like, okay, well, how would I know if this person is going to trigger me, if they're going to be right for me, if their triggers are going to offset mine? My opinion is if we're healed sufficiently to a point where we feel like we're ready, those things are going to kind of filter themselves out, because we're not going to want to really be with somebody who's just toxic. Their triggers just are horrible.
Well, and that's why we need to put in the time, but the time doesn't mean months and weeks. It means hours. I was talking to somebody earlier today. It's kind of like if I spend like multiple 3-day weekends in a row where it's just that person and me, I'm putting in 36 hours. That's different than, we spend 10 hours a week together for 3 months. It's like, after a while, it's going to add up to be the same. I think the key that we got to be looking for is during that time, there's two things. Do they trigger me? And the other thing is, do I get easily triggered? I mean, like Cathy was saying, we got to be willing to self-evaluate. Just because I get triggered doesn't mean that they're triggering.
Right.
It
And
could
some
mean
people
that
think it's
I'm
the Holy
easily triggered.
Spirit.
But if I got the combination of two people where they both people either don't trigger or they trigger rarely and they quickly correct, like, I can tell that hurt you somehow, please tell me what I can do to fix that, or you got the other person is resilient, meaning, hey, that did kind of tweak me a little bit, I felt it, but I'm able to evaluate and realize that that's not necessarily that person. That's something from my past that got brought up. So it may be 10% that person, but it's 90% what happened to me before.
Yeah. And, John, I would love to just kind of reiterate, because I feel like I just want to very succinctly say the 3 things, essential elements for healing that we came up with. Radical acceptance of your loss, making space in your mind and heart for future blessings and relationships, being open to the possibility that maybe this trial is ultimately setting you up for some of your greatest blessings and your greatest joy. And some people really have a hard time opening themselves up to that, because sometimes we think divorce must have been something that went wrong, rather than it was part of my life path and it was part of my way forward.
Right.
And so if we can get to the point where we accept the loss, we make space for future blessings, and then we compassionately self-evaluate and unwind cognitive distortions that Jeff was talking about and that you were talking about, then we're ready to date. It's just those 3 things.
Yeah. And if you think about that old quote from President Kimball, that any two faithful members of the church can be happy together, I would just add to that, any 2 faithful members of the church who have adequately, not completely, healed. And I think those are great barometers you just listed, Cathy, of whether someone is healed. I truly believe they could be happy with anyone else who's like that.
Yeah. Healed
I really
enough.
believe that.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Well, and then I guess I want to go to what you were saying about triggered, because one of the questions that came up when I was going through the questions that I had been posed was, what if I'm triggered after I start dating? Does that mean I haven't healed enough? Because that's something a lot of people ask. Like, if they're out on a date and they're triggered, must not be healed enough. I think the answer to that is no. I think what it means actually is that you're being given a gift of a new layer healing for you, because it's coming up. And because you were brave enough to let new people into your life, that trigger in the dating relationship is an opportunity to continue healing as you date.
And you know what? Give yourself a pat on the back for recognizing that it was a trigger and that it wasn't the other person's fault, right?
Mhm.
That's a huge key, because if we blame the other person for whatever it is that caused our trigger, then we're not going to get anywhere. But if we're like, dang, that was a trigger, and where'd that come from? I'm not sure. But being willing to recognize it and saying, hey, I'm going to work on this. I think that that's fine during
Right.
dating. I think that shows growth, like you're saying. I think that shows that you're trying to become the person you need to be to get into an eternal relationship.
And obviously,
if
if
I
the other
could-
person says, you know, shut up, I hate you, and you can go stick it up your ear.
Right.
Yeah, obviously, there's a certain level of toxicity where you can say, yeah, I'm pretty sure that was them.
Yeah.
You know, and so that doesn't mean we have to put up with abuse or anything. But I think in relationships, very often what's the case is it's a lack of resilience sometimes, especially when we've been hurt deeply in the past. And as long as we're aware of that, I think those are things we can get over.
Yep. I
And
agree.
and if I could add to that, because there was a part of Everett's question that I want to be really clear on. How can I tell who won't trigger me? I think that's the wrong question. I think the answer to that question is everyone will trigger you. At some point, you get close enough to somebody and they will step on your toes. They will bump up against the emotional sunburns you have on your back, so to speak. So it isn't a question of who won't trigger me and, oh, if someone triggers me, they must be wrong for me. I think really the question is, what can I do to recognize my own triggers and become accustomed to feeling that trauma rising up inside us? And then secondly, is this a person who is self-reflective, like Cathy talked about? Is this a person who is willing to look at their own self? And can we together work to create a safe place for each other in our relationship? And honestly, I think if I look back on the big moments in our relationship before we were married, the story that I told earlier about how I got triggered, I actually sat down and wrote a very vulnerable letter to Cathy after that happened, and told her this is what I was going through, and this is what I believe about it. And her response was really beautiful, actually. It was accepting. It was, I think it shows great personal insight, and it's understandable that you would be fearful given what you've gone through in your life. And so that was one moment when I thought, wow, this person is special. And then another one that comes immediately to mind is there was a night right after we got back together and started to date for marriage.
This was after a year of friendship where we were not dating each
Not
other.
dating. But yeah, she and I were spending an evening together, and it was at my place. And we were talking through some particularly sensitive issues about our breakup a year earlier. And we were both getting triggered left, right, and center. And every now and then during that conversation, Cathy would say, Jeff, this is going south fast. We need to either stop talking or kneel down and pray together and shift this. And probably 4 or 5 times that night, she made that suggestion and we did it. We would kneel down and pray, and it would shift things in a positive direction. And I remember after that thinking, yep, this is the woman I want to marry for sure. That was sealed the deal in my mind.
That's great. I think that, Cathy had posed the question, what do people think that you can still date if you get triggered, or does that mean you're not ready yet? But here you guys are in a marriage. And I think this is very important to note that you're married and still experiencing some of those triggers. So to think that you have to be completely free of triggers that's wrong thinking, because I don't know, again, there's no finish line in this life. Yeah, we're going to be triggered in all kinds of ways in this life. That's just going to be part of this growth opportunity that we have here in our mortal existence. I think the real question is, what kind of triggers? I mean, are these people that are going to consistently push buttons and try to trigger, and it just becomes a toxic relationship? Or how do you handle the triggers in a situation like you guys did that sounds very healthy, and say, okay, Cathy triggered me, or John triggered me, or Jeff or Celeste, or whoever is triggering who, in that moment, you can stop and say, all right, I'm triggered. And so is this me? Is it them? How do I process this, and how do I handle it?
Right. Well, and a thought that came to me is that if being triggered in dating relationships is a continuation of healing as you date, then being triggered in marriage is a continuation of healing as you interact with your spouse. Like it especially if like you're handling them with that accountability, with that responsibility that I am responsible for my own emotional well-being. And if I'm feeling triggered, then I got to figure out, do I need a timeout? Do we need to talk? Like, and are they willing to talk? And if they're not willing to talk, let's be respectful and wait until they're ready. Like, and then are we able to come back together and work things out? Like when we're both calm.
Right.
Well, John probably knows the statistic that if the Gottmans did this study of people, as they talked about relationship issues, if one or the other person's heart rate reached above 100 beats per minute, there was a 0% chance they were going to resolve the problem during that conversation. And so what are they achieving by going on in that conversation? They're just saying hurtful things, damaging their relationship, you know, and again, calling a timeout isn't a way to hold the other person over the fire. It's not a way, it's not a punishment. It's not,
and it's not avoidance,
it's not avoidance. It is taking a moment, 20 minutes to a few hours normally to get calm so that you can have a productive conversation, and then you can resolve it quickly. One other thing about triggers, the fact that I'm triggered doesn't mean I have to yell and scream and act like a maniac. If I'm triggered and I know I'm triggered, I can call a timeout. I can go get in my car and go for a drive. I can, go to a separate room and just breathe. I mean, the fact that I'm triggered doesn't mean I have no options.
Right.
How to handle.
And my triggers aren't the responsibility of another person.
No.
Another
Right.
person
They're
can
mine to
help or
manage.
hurt my chances of overcoming the trigger. But in the end, it's my trigger. And generally the people in front of me aren't the ones that created the original trauma that trigger's tied to. And so, that quote, that we heal or else we'll bleed on the people who didn't cut us, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And we need to be careful about that.
And to go off of the, just real quick, to go off of the emotional healing or the emotional timeout aspect, I think that's fabulous because I think that gives you a chance to not react off of your emotions, right? Not react by how you're feeling. Because I think a lot of times nowadays, there's just a lot of people out there making choices based on how they feel versus based on logic. And I think those timeouts give you time to process the emotion, think more clearly, and then make your choices from that point forward in a logical, using your mind and brain manner versus going off of just your emotion.
Yeah, and invite the spirit back in.
Exactly.
We recommend that people never make a relationship decision when they're in trauma, when they're triggered.
Yeah.
Because
or when it's feeling urgent, because usually that's when
We
you're in
don't-
trauma.
we don't.
And that
think, well,
includes both rushing in and ending it.
Right.
Yeah.
Both are going to be maybe a mistake if we're doing it from a place of fear.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, your trauma will tell you I have to end this now because you're in fight or flight. So either I need to say really damaging things and hurt somebody, or fight back, or I need to get out of this relationship right now. Both of those things are lies. Both of those things are untrue, but our brain is 2 million years old and it's got self-preservation instincts. And so, and those are overgeneralized. but there is almost no situation where you would have to end it in the next 5 minutes. You can almost always wait a day or two and get some calmness. And then if you still believe it's a good idea to end it, then do. But
Yeah,
But
we
make sure
definitely
you're
don't
calm.
recommend just waiting forever to either move forward or back out.
Yeah,
Like once you know.
I mean,
but-
for an anxious attached person, that you're going to destroy the relationship with them. You know, they're going to feel that sense of abandonment, and that's going to be hard. I just think there's where balance comes in again. You
Right.
know, if you tend to want space, stretch toward your partner toward connection. If you tend to want connection, stretch toward giving them more space. You know, and together you're probably going to create a healthier environment, and you may actually turn out to be pretty secure in your attachment to each other eventually. So
Yeah, and you know,
I
would, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you know, our brains may be 2 million years old, but our spirits are timeless, and that's the good
Right.
news. And I just think if we can hand it over to our timeless spirits, they can override, you know, whatever we inherit physically, you know, and give us a shot at a more accurate and blessed version of reality, you know.
Yeah, well, and I think that goes perfect with a response we got to Jeff's article by one of our Lily members. I just want to read this because I thought it was really profound. She said, I was actively working on healing and I was dating quite a bit. Most of the time I'd go on a date or two with a man and we could tell it wouldn't work, so we became friends. No loss because it helped me figure out what I wanted and provided companionship. I had a few experiences that hurt, but most were positive, even though they didn't result in marriage. I still was pretty fragile when I met my now and forever husband. When I reached the point that I wanted him in my life more than I feared it, I knew it was time to commit. We were married and sealed 4 weeks later. It hasn't always been easy. I still go to therapy and I keep working on taking out the garbage from my past. Sometimes that garbage stinks up our relationship, but we work through it. It's been far more joyful than not, and taking that leap to marry him was the best decision of my life. I enjoy contentment, security, love, and happiness that I'd never had before. We have had 7 happy years together, and I look forward to an eternity more. How cool is that?
That is
I think that's a
awesome.
really good example of someone who is working on herself and dating and willing to try new relationships and ultimately commit because she decided when she reached the point that she wanted him in her life more than she feared it, that was her time. Like, and I think that's a big factor too, as we're dating. If we can get beyond the fear and want what we desire more, that's a big game changer.
I love that passage in 1 Timothy 1:7. For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind. Now, if you think about the opposites of power, love, and a sound mind, well, the opposite of love would be fear. It could also be hate, in the sense that fear causes us to put up walls with other people. Power, the opposite of that would be weakness, and fear makes us weak, right? And then a sound mind, the opposite of that is insanity. If we're feeling like, okay, we're not holding it together, our mind isn't clear, if we're feeling weak and helpless, if we're feeling hatred or anger or disappointment in someone else, okay, those feelings do not come from God. The feeling that comes from God is love. It's the opposite. It is power, love, and a sound mind.
I just want to interject one thing here while we're kind of going through this, because we run into a lot of people. I think these are fantastic. I don't want to be sort of, pouring any water on a flame on this, but we run into a lot of people who say, I'm ready. I've done all the healing I can do. I feel like I'm just sitting around waiting for the Lord to bless me. This stinks. I've been waiting for years. And I just want to basically kind of reiterate the point that this is sort of a two-way blessing, right? Like it takes Jeff and Cathy, right, to be in a spot where you're ready to get married, or whoever. So Heavenly Father obviously wants to bless all of us in a way that we're in a relationship. For all of us that are wanting, for everybody that's felt like maybe they've been on those dates for 5-10 years. My goodness, I've dated and I'm ready. What is taking so long? Maybe you're ready, and maybe Heavenly Father has somebody fantastic in mind for you, and maybe they're just simply not, right?
Mhm.
The other part, it's a two-way blessing. I would also state that Heavenly Father wants all of us to have those desires fulfilled. He has a timeline, and sometimes part of our trial from him is just being patient and trusting in him. Whatever that might look like, I just don't want people to think like I've gotten to this point where I'm healed, and so I'm ready to bless me. Pour it on me, Heavenly Father. Here I am, right? It doesn't always work that way. And I think that part of that trusting in the Lord is trusting in his timing as well. And that can be a very, very hard pill to swallow, especially the longer it drags out. So
I think the way the fact that you brought that up is like really significant, that we might be ready, maybe even more than we think we're ready, but our best match isn't. And maybe we've been praying for that best match and God's preparing them, but they're just not ready yet.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's like a bell curve, like we all have kind of that ideal timeline, it's somewhere between 6 months and a year, I mean, I'm just guessing at that, but we say, then, then, or you can know, but of course, there's exceptions to that rule. There are people who date for a year or two and it turns out to be a disaster anyway. And there are people who get married, like some of my friends, and it's fast and it turns out blissful. I think trusting God is easy in the window. When we go out to either extreme.
Sorry. We love you,
Did
John.
somebody say something?
No, you did.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
We love you, John. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, but
I like
think
how you always throw the little my friends in there thing. Like
I know.
Slip it in under the rug real quick. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay.
It's
Anyway,
stuff.
I'll try not to be distracted by these two co-hosts. But I think when we get outside the bell curve, like we get out of the kind of the 70%, we get into the wings a little bit. Now it's nervous, and that's where surrender is really hard. Because on one end, we're thinking, I'm out of my ever-loving mind. There's no way this is going to work this fast. And on the other end, I'm thinking, there's no way I'm going to wait anymore. Like, I can't do this. This is way too long. Thankfully, I think God requires of most of us just the middle ground. I think that's fine. And probably for 80-90% of us, that's how it's going to go. And I'm talking 80-90% of us who end up with successful relationships.
Right.
Okay. But I do think there's going to be the outliers who took a way long time. I also have friends who've waited 2.5, 3 years, and it turned out great. And just like I have friends, and so I have friends in both sides of the equation. I think the bigger question is, have you healed sufficiently? Are you spiritually connected enough to where the message really is God's message and not your body, not your mind, not your emotions? None of that. And I think getting to that place is more important than the dating side of things. It's am I in tune with the Spirit? Basically what it comes down to. And what have we been taught that we really need to do, especially in these last days? And I think that applies to dating too. Being in tune with the Spirit is going to save us is going to be the one thing that can save us from the darkest time in history. And that includes the people we date, which some of them are really hurt and downright sick, and they could really land up in a bad relationship.
Yeah, and that goes well with the question: why is it important to take time to focus on internal repair prior to dating? My answer was so we can be a healthy person and attract a healthy partner. And I think that goes right along with what you were saying, to have the Spirit with us, because that's part of being a healthy person and attracting a healthy partner is being healed enough that the spirit's back in our lives, because we're no longer trying to fight against reality and kick and scream and be so frustrated and bitter, like we're able to release that and let it go and get back onto a more hopeful path.
And there's actually a question in the chat that was saying they're saying, I get that concept. I know I need to be asking the Lord for direction and having him lead my path. But sometimes I struggle discerning what the Lord wants me to do. And I think that's like in every aspect of our life, right? We've been taught to follow the Spirit, but sometimes that can be tricky because sometimes it might be our own thoughts, or because how many times have people been like, oh, I had a revelation, you're supposed to be with me. And the other person's like, no, that's not how I feel. So this is one thing I just want to throw out. And I think that is a personal answer. I think we come through experience and trying out, was this a prompting or was it not, whatever, we will learn how to read the Spirit well. But I think one thing that's really super important to keep in mind is if we are asking the Lord for guidance, if we are daily praying and saying, help me to understand thy will and help me to know which path to take, if we take the wrong path, he won't let us go so far that there's no way to turn around. And he's promised us that. So even if we're like, okay, I'm not sure which path I'm supposed to go down, but I'm going to start down this one, just have a belief and faith in knowing that if I go down the wrong path, at some point it's gonna be like, yeah, okay, you need to turn around. And so that's an important part. So don't be sitting back and waiting for the Lord to be like giving you the green flag. Okay, this is the right route, because guess what? This is a learning opportunity here on earth. And he wants us to have agency and learn through our mistakes and through every decision we make. So he's going to let us go down some wrong paths here and there to give us experience on how to read him and the Spirit.
Well, and I think too, like it's the, we want to dictate how that Spirit's going to show up, and I think what we need to do is take a step back. And I love a quote I saw the other day, and it said something to the effect, rather than searching for another person, search for yourself, and that other person will come into your life. And I do think there's some truth to that. I think also in answer to Heidi's question on the her message here, it's basically, in the dialogue, she said, when you're doing everything right and they're just that you're hearing crickets, I think silence, we got to understand what silence means. And silence may just mean it's not a hard no, it's not a hard yes. What it is just stay on your current course and don't do anything drastic. Yep. Just see how this pans. I rather than tell you yes or no, I need you to just follow through on the path I sent you on. And the answer will come to you in a very natural way. And it might take a month and it might take 6 months. I don't know. But until you hear a yes or a no, stick with it.
Yeah. And I think if you start moving, God can guide your footprints if you're moving.
Right.
But if you're standing still, how does he steer you? Right. And so I think sometimes he really wants us to move forward with faith in our own judgment. And then he'll let us know. Like there was one time where I broke up with Jeff to date someone else exclusively. And then that relationship ended the next day. So that was clearly the wrong path.
So and it flipped out the first night and just said, well, you don't care about me. You don't love me. Just go off with the other guy. Screw that guy.
Well, it was more like he kind of ghosted me. And I was like, wait a minute, I do not commit easily. Why did I do this? That was clearly the wrong direction, but it was me being brave to try something, right? Just to move in a direction. So I do think we find out pretty quickly if it's either the right direction and we'll feel peace and it will work out really easily, or it'll just kind of fizzle.
And someone brought up the issue too, that sometimes we call it the wrong path. Like I look at my first 2 marriages and you could say, well, that was the wrong path. Man, the lessons I learned in those marriages, I mean, that's my journey in this life, and I didn't make those decisions out of, anything wrong. I was being a good boy, doing the right thing, and I felt impressed to marry those women. And they taught me valuable lessons that I'll probably use for the rest of eternity. And so I'm not going to say I made a mistake with them. What I'm going to say is I needed lessons. And so what that represented was some character issues in me that needed to be ironed out. And so what I have to admit is not that I made a mistake. It's that I had some weaknesses that needed to be ironed out. And those experiences were perfect for that. And in many ways, they've prepared me for a better marriage moving forward.
Oh yeah. And Jeff and I say the same thing. And I no longer regret either of my previous marriages. They were both meant for my learning and growth. I know they were part of my life path. And I think that that's true for everyone. And the reason why is because if it's happened, it was part of your life path. I mean, you might as well see it that way, because anything else is just going to keep you internally hurting.
Right.
Yeah, and we are definitely better for each other. We've thought, well, couldn't we have just met sooner and made it much more simple? But no, we couldn't, because we're not the same people if we hadn't have gone through those experiences.
Yeah.
It
And
would be great if we could just instantly have everything given to us when we want it, right? Like, why did I have to go through all those struggles? Like, well, because that's how you grew.
Right.
and I
Yeah.
was just real quick, I was just going to point out something that's important about what Cathy said about how she had broke up and then that one ended really quickly. But you have to wonder, if you wouldn't have opted for that experience, would you have always wondered what would have come about? Right. So I think sometimes when we take those little paths, we take a choice, we make our, use our agency, that wasn't the best option, probably not my best choice, but at least it removes the question of, what would have happened if I did go down that route. Give ourselves some grace in those moments. And I think that all of our choices, I personally am more of a believer of our agency brings about our life versus the Lord getting and messing with our lives. I think that he gives us a lot of opportunities. And I think those opportunities can take us down a whole bunch of just various paths. And I think once we make a path, pick a choice and go down a path, he then opens up other opportunities. That's more my understanding of it. But I do think either way, if you feel like the Lord is pushing you down a path, or if you feel like he's opening opportunities and you're going down paths, he will at all times try to give us what's best for us. And if we take those opportunities, if we move down those paths, and if we, if it doesn't work out right, we can still learn from those experiences. We can still use that to become a better person and become the person that we want to attract, or similar to someone we want to attract in our life that would be more compatible. So even if, no matter how your belief system is on that, if you take each of your experiences, whether it was good or bad, and use it to make you a better person, then it's a win, no matter if it was a right choice or not.
Well, and going down that wrong path, I have my awesome story about my maple leaf. And for those who have heard me talk before, those who have read the book, Intentional Courtship, they'll know about this, but I'll just tell you briefly that after that happened, because it was really bizarre to me that I finally had the courage to walk into a relationship and then it just fizzled, right? And I had the temptation to, ruminate for days, that thing where you just think about it over and over and all constantly. And it sucks the life out of you for several days or weeks or months or whatever. And I remembered a conversation I'd had with the same person who said, plants and plants and bushes and trees, they're so amazing because they know how to take poison and turn it into love and life. So think about it. We literally put poison on our plants and trees and grass, and they know how to make life with it. How cool is that? And if we can do the same thing with relationships that fizzle, and this is where I learned the concept of radical acceptance without knowing what it was called. And I went and I picked a leaf off my tree. I flattened it in a book. It was like a red flaming maple. Anyway, I still have the leaf. And it just reminds me that at any time when I don't know how to accept a situation, I can just choose. I can just choose to allow it and let it be what it is and have it turn to life in me rather than digressing.
Right. I love that. I love
Yeah.
that.
And I learned that from going down the wrong path for a second.
Yeah,
And that, so it probably wasn't the wrong path, like you said.
Exactly. I mean, it's like if you're learning from it, it's like, okay, that didn't work out right. But you know what? I'm going to take what I learned from this situation and help me become a better person. Because I don't think that there's many of us that would look back on our challenges and want to relive them, but we also wouldn't want to lose what we've learned from those experiences. And I think that's what the Lord wants us to do. We can become bitter. I don't want to learn from this. I'm just mad. I'm mad at God. I'm mad at everybody, and just not grow from the experience. Or we can take that experience and make us better and to become a better person and be more prepared for who we're meant to be with.
Well, and to John's mention earlier, he said, you know, if you're out of the curve, like it can be a lot harder to hang on. Like if you're out of that 6 months, 2 year, well, I mean, how many of us are like 50 and still searching for our someone? I mean, a lot of us, right? I mean, so really like this path
older than that.
this path is really long sometimes for us. You know, we might have had other relationships along the way, but if, you know, if we're single again, we're still looking or we're still wanting, you know, and so we recently did, let's see, is that out yet? The
What?
Power of Yet?
No.
Oh, not out yet. So make sure make sure everybody goes and subscribes to LilyTube. So that's our YouTube channel, and we have a video coming out in the future and a podcast very soon on the power of yet. Actually, I think the video is, but the podcast isn't. Anyway, the power of yet. I believe that the video is called Believing Impossible Things, and that is out. But the power of yet is from my early days as a Suzuki teacher, where one of my little students, she's like maybe 6 or 7. Oh, they want to know what the site is. So if you go to YouTube, like just the YouTube app, and search for Love in Later Years, you'll find us, or LilyTube. And then any podcast app has Lily Pod on it. So Lily, Lily pod, and LilyTube. Anyway, but so she's 6 or 7. She's practicing with her dad at home. And she just kept saying, I don't get it. I can't get it. Like, no, I can't get it. Like, no matter what I do, I can't get it. And he went to their living room wall, and a big black marker, he wrote the word yet, Y-E-T, cap, you know, exclamation point. And then they sent me a picture of it. And he was trying to instill in her the idea that just because you haven't got it, just because it hasn't happened, it's not over.
No,
There's a yet.
No.
Yes. If you can add yet.
Yeah.
Yes. So if you can add yet to everything that hasn't happened in your life yet, we're on an eternal, road here, you know, even if there's certain things you think have passed you by in this life, it's not over.
Yeah. And we're at a time in history. You know, the restoration is speeding up. And when we say the restoration, we're talking about the restoration of the church, but we're also talking about the restoration of God's people. You know, we're talking about the restoration of relationships. We're talking about the restoration of people who are sick or afflicted or struggling or traumatized, or, you know, I think sometimes we put limits on what God can do for us, and we give up on ourselves and on other people. And man, that's why surrender is so important. If we surrender our lives over, I just really think he can work miracles, and probably faster than we think. And I think he's going to do that, yes, for the world and for the church, but I think he'll do it for each of us personally. And I think that includes our relationships, you know?
I pictured, I was talking to a friend, chatting with a friend earlier this evening, when I said, sometimes I like to visualize God sitting up on his heavenly throne, looking down on me and just saying, hey, kid, be patient. I've got something much better in mind for you. Don't give up on me. And, sooner or later, he's always come through, and things that I thought were tragedies were tender mercies. I look back on my first marriage, and it wasn't all bad. We lived in the Samoan Islands together and had some amazing adventures in the South Pacific. I look back on that and cherish it. I don't look back on it tainted by what happened since. But I also understand that if I hadn't been through the painful experience of divorce, which is the hardest thing I've ever done for sure, I wouldn't have Cathy. I wouldn't have her two sons as my stepsons, and this relationship is what I always dreamed a relationship would be. So, I think it's tempting sometimes to think about, well, it wasn't meant to turn out like this. Well, gosh, it hasn't turned out yet, until you're dead, it hasn't turned out. It's
even then,
you're on a journey.
Even then.
Even then.
Yeah.
Yeah. And understanding that eternal perspective can really help with our patience. Like
Jeff and Cathy, are you familiar with the story of Elder Renlund's mission president's wife? Have you heard that story before? I think this is a fascinating story, and I always kind of go back to this because I think it illustrates a lot of what we're talking about here. Elder Renlund obviously was close with his mission president. His mission president came home after finishing his mission. As he put it, he had some health issues and ended up getting a divorce from his wife. He ran off with another lady, and his wife clearly was devastated. But she spent 30 years. She moved away with the kids, raised the rest of the kids, grandkids, served 4 additional missions. And, feel free to look this up. I think he talks about it in a BYU talk. He ends up going back to his mission president after he becomes an apostle, kind of touching base with him again. His mission president's wife, his mission president had left the church and everything. His wife, the mission president's wife, waited 30 years while he was off with this other woman. The other woman eventually leaves him, and she forgives him and takes him back after 30 years. And they come back together. I think they're in their mid to late 80s or something like that. They have a few years left together, and then he passes away. But he ends up getting his blessings restored. He gets the marriage restored. And the whole time, imagine for 30 years, your husband had left you with the kids, run off with another lady. And what did she do the whole time? She just was patient. She served 4 missions on her own. She was active in temple work. She just let the Lord take control and dictate how this was going to pan out. And as Elder Renlund puts it, in an act of incomprehensible charity and forgiveness, she takes him back. When the other lady eventually leaves him and he's left all alone in his later years, right? And she forgives him in that moment.
I'd actually like to say a word or two about forgiveness.
Yeah.
The verse in the Bible, in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect."
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know if you've ever read the verses leading up to that in connection with that, but they say, you've heard it has been said, love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy, but I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and persecute you. And it goes on with that familiar passage about loving your enemies and praying for those that despitefully use and persecute you. And I kind of understood that was the hardest thing we would ever do in this life, in our effort to become perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect. But I didn't, until I got divorced, understand truly what it was to have an enemy, to really hate somebody. And I'm not proud of that. I don't hate her anymore. I care about her now, but there was a period of time when I really blamed her for everything that was wrong in my life and every hard feeling I had. And, the idea at that time of praying for her, of wishing her well, of, doing good to her, just felt, foreign to everything inside me. But what was inside me was the natural man. It was.
But can you imagine remarrying her?
No.
Like, I don't know that most of us could
Right.
or would want to.
Forgiving her means, well, there was another time years later when I thought I had forgiven her, when she started doing something manipulative that reminded me, or I thought it was manipulative, that reminded me of things that had happened during our marriage, and I could feel this anger welling up inside of me. And then I thought, wait a minute, I've got to put this feeling down. And it's like, I think if you can feel yourself picking up the rock, if you can understand that that's what's happening, you can intentionally lay it back down again. And for me, it strikes me that that's really what it means when Jesus says to forgive 70 times 7.
Right.
That sometimes you are going to get triggered, you are going to have those feelings, and you've just got to keep putting the rock down every time you find yourself picking it up, because there's nothing there but heaviness, poison, and
Yeah.
unhappiness.
And let's go back to what we said
Well,
about.
can I just say something on that real quick? You
yeah,
can
go
do, here's what people got to realize. Forgiveness is not trust.
Right.
So you can put that rock down every single time while also keeping your shield up, and not allowing yourself to be repeatedly abused. And so setting boundaries is one thing. You can set boundaries with someone that you totally forgive, even though you never see them again in this life. And I think some people get confused and think that if I forgive, I have to trust, or that if I can't trust, I can't forgive. And we need to separate those two.
Yeah, totally agreed. And I was just going to say that just because you're triggered doesn't mean that you haven't healed enough to date. And just because you are feeling
Right.
some of that hatred come up again doesn't mean that you haven't forgiven as much as you could until that point, right? So it's a process.
Right.
I don't think we're ever just like, I've forgiven them, I'm done.
Right.
Maybe sometimes people are, but I think sometimes we get the opportunity to put the rock back down.
Yeah. And I know we're running out of time, but I saw this meme today on Facebook and I took it because I was like, this is fabulous. And this is exactly what y'all are saying. It says, when you finally learn that a person's behavior has more to do with their own internal struggle than it ever did with you, you learn grace. And I think that is what it is like. I think we all just have to realize, like, yes, we might have hatred. We might have a lot of anger for other people for what they've put us through and the pain and suffering. But in all actuality, it's their own internal strife that is causing them to treat you, unless you were, causing issues. But in general, like it's them. And I think when we can pray, and I've been helping my daughter with this because she's struggling with someone in particular. I'm like, if we can pray for those who hurt us, because we recognize deep inside they are hurting, and we may not know the cause for their hurt or their pain, but if we can pray and ask the Lord, I know I don't like this person very much right now, but can you help them deal with whatever they're struggling with? Then is that not the same grace that the Lord gives us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So,
I agree.
But let me say something about that too, really fast. If you think about letting go, suppose you're holding a bowling ball or a hot air balloon or both, and you simply loosen your grip, that bowling ball falls to the ground, that balloon starts to float upward, and it either way, it goes away and you've let it go. Well, holding on is the hard part. Letting go is easier. So why do we still hold on instead of let go sometimes for years? The reason is because in our mind, we believe that it somehow serves us to hold on to that. Now, our brain wants to be right more than it wants to be happy. So it will hold on to, well, maybe my marriage failed, but it wasn't my fault. Maybe my marriage failed, but it was the other person's fault. And being in the right sort of gives you a sense of validation. But what I'm going to testify to is that is a very cheap substitute for real love, for real peace, and all the rest of it. And if we can get the idea that, all right, you know what, I don't have to blame anybody anymore. I can simply let this go. All of that angst is going to be replaced by peace and love.
Well, and then we have the power to look at ourselves more, more securely, because we've just given grace to someone else, and we can give ourselves grace as we examine ourselves and what we can do different, which we have power to do. And we don't have power over what other people do. So that's how we take back power. Now, I wanted to, if that's okay, I know, like, because we're running short on time, I'd really love to address like two things that we haven't yet. And one of them was a question I believe Celeste asked, and it was, how do we recognize red flags in us? And I thought that was such an awesome question, because it assumes responsibility and accountability for our own emotional well-being, like we've talked about, and how we're showing up in relationships. And the greatest sin is always the one I'm not willing to repent of. That's always kind of something I've tried to live by. I'm not perfect at it, but I usually think, okay, there's no pointing fingers here, because the only one that matters is what I can do, right? And then I think the answer to the question is to pray and ask God to help us see how we're showing up with some red flags, because he can help us change them if we can see them. You know, he'll always help us see our weaknesses if we'll ask him to show us.
Yep.
Yep.
And that's hard.
It is, but it takes humility. But you know what? If we consider, you know, the Lord wants to make our weaknesses strengths, then we're like, okay, it's scriptural. He wants me to see my faults so that he can help us strengthen them. And it's okay. Like he wants us to.
Yes.
Hard to
And
plan.
something else that's scriptural that I really, really wanted to focus on, because we talked about what's essential healing, radical acceptance, making space, and unwinding cognitive distortions. So we talked about that, but what is successful dating? And you know what my answer is? And it's like really odd. You probably won't even you'll be like, why is she saying this? I think the answer is actually, in healthy new relationships, start with self-love and self-acceptance. And let me give you 3 reasons why. For those of you who are familiar with Brené Brown, this is directly from her book about, it's The Gifts of Imperfection, if any of you have heard of that. We can only love ourselves as much as we love, we can only love others as much as we love ourselves. Our unresolved issues are like secondhand smoke. And negative thoughts and feelings and behaviors do not just affect ourselves. And that's the reason why. And then our sense of belonging can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance. And I'd never heard that before until just like, I've just been pondering it this week. Our sense of belonging can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance. So loving and accepting ourselves are the ultimate acts of courage.
I think to add to that, one of the most common messages in the New Testament, it's said in various ways, is that we will receive the mercy we extend to others. With what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and things like that. There's a statement in the Lord's Prayer that says it a little bit different way. But I believe we will judge ourselves by the same standards that we judge other people. So if I'm harsh on my former spouse, I'm going to be harsh on myself too. And I think if I can give them grace, it's easier to give myself grace.
Yeah. Well, and the other reason, okay, so there's the other really big reason why I think it's important to consider self-love and self-acceptance as one of the most important things of beginning a healthy new relationship. So we all are familiar with the the 2 great commandments. I'll just quickly read them. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And the as thyself isn't an afterthought. It's actually an integral part of real love and divine love. I don't know if you guys have ever read Real Love by Dr. Greg Bear, but divine love is another concept that was brought to our attention, that like it's a better use of the term unconditional love is divine love. So divine love and real love include loving God, ourselves, and our neighbors. And it's all congruent, like it all goes together.
Mhm.
I love
And-
that.
yeah.
Sorry, did you finish? I didn't want to cut you off.
Almost, yeah, almost. I just wanted to say that most of us could use to stand a little more of love thyself into our intentional efforts, because I think our religious culture is really good about expressing that we need to be selfless, expressing that we need to, love our Heavenly Father and, take on callings and make sacrifices and all that.
Mhm.
And I think he wants us to show up in joy. I think he wants us to show up with light and goodness. And we can only do that when we take care of what we need to for ourselves, like be responsible for our own emotional well-being. That's part of it, is like, have I fed myself? Have I slept well? Like, am I showing up as my best and highest self so that I can serve to my fullest capacity?
Let me add to that too. I know we're running out of time, but Dr. Greg Bear wrote a book called Real Love. Probably a lot of you are familiar with it. And I read it and I fought with it most of the way through the first time. And this was 11, 12 years ago, something like that. And I couldn't, it was hard for me to get past the idea that if somebody loved me, said they would love me forever and marry me and all of that, that they could make the choice to go back on that. And at the bottom line, I was having a hard time honoring agency. Anyway, ultimately, I surrendered to the idea that love not freely given is not real, and you have to let people give freely without force, manipulation, any of that.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then 11 years later, I became friends with Dr. Greg Bear, just kind of by accident almost. And that was cool because you don't always get to meet your heroes, but he was one of mine. And anyway, he made a point when we interviewed him on our podcast that,
And that's episode 69, I believe.
basically-
It's a really good discussion. He's awesome. And he and his wife, they practice real love in their marriage, which is really cool.
right. And he basically said, you can't give from an empty bucket, that if you don't have a sufficient amount of real love that you've received, you can't give it away. And so he says, if you lack real love and the ability to love others as a result, you have to go out and find that. You have to find wise people who will accept you without you needing to change.
Mm-hmm.
And that is part of preparing to date. It's
Yes.
part of healing. Now, he makes the point when we pressed him on it, well, when Cathy pressed him on it, that yes, you can get all of that from God, but it requires a lot more faith, because it's easier to see that love of God channeled through another person sitting in front of you, so to speak. And if we're getting it straight from God, it takes more faith. So one thing I'm going to recommend to everybody here, wherever you are in your healing journey, find a few wise people who will love you, accept you, even if even if you're not ready to change, whatever, that just accept you as you are. And once you have that, to quote that movie, Field of Dreams, the wind never blows quite so cold again.
Well, and I just really like to throw in here that we're practicing what Greg Bear teaches, which is to practice with same-sex friends before dating. And so we have a men's and a women's group, a Lily men. So I think it's Knights of the Lily and Lily Ladies. And they're established groups and they're really awesome. And if you want a place of like unconditional love and to come and feel edified each month, then we invite you to join our coaching groups, because they're really good and it can help you. So it's you can just message either one of us about that if you're interested.
Great.
By the way, I've got another book coming out, which is written to men, and Dr. Greg Bear wrote the foreword. So
Okay.
anyway, it's a while.
And-
That's going to be a little while still.
Yeah.
Fantastic. We'll have
Stay
you back
tuned.
on to promote that one too. So,
Yeah.
well, hey, we're way over time. I just wanted to kind of wrap it up here and say, first of all, thank you very much. I wanted to end with a quote. As you guys are talking about self-healing, anybody who's trying to kind of find their path or maybe figure out ways to kind of heal themselves, I always go back to this quote, and I'm sure John's heard it a million times, by Carl Jung. It's a little long, so bear with me for a second. It says, the acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life. That I feed the hungry, that I forgive an insult, that I love my enemy in the name of Christ, all these are undoubtedly great virtues. What I do unto the least of my brethren, that I do unto Christ. But what if I should discover that the least among them all, the poorest of all the beggars, the most impudent of all the offenders, the very enemy himself, that these are all within me, and that I myself stand in need of the alms of my own kindness, that I myself am the enemy who must be loved. What then? I love that thought.
Profound.
Yeah, I love that every time I read it. It's just something that kind of hits home of like, listen, all of these things, it's great to forgive other people, but it starts within us. And that's our journey. So I just want to end with that and say thank you guys very much for coming on. Anybody who's interested in finding out a little more, is maybe struggling on their journey, or even getting started on their healing journey. Maybe you've just recently gone through a divorce or a bad breakup and you're looking for some advice or maybe a little coaching. Don't ever hesitate to reach out. Jeff and Cathy have a great LilyTube and other resources that they've done with their podcast. They also do coaching.
Lily Pod.
Lily Pod. There you go. Lily Pod, LilyTube, Lily, I don't know, Pat.
All the lilies.
So,
They're
yeah,
out.
the
Lily,
Lily stuff.
anything Lily you can come up with, they got it. So
loveinlateryears.com is our website, and there's a link tree on there also.
yes, absolutely. You guys are fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, and sorry we went over. We're really passionate about this stuff and we could talk for
Okay.
hours, but thanks for cutting us off.
No, it's
And-
fine. Yeah.
I think
The
we got
reality
through the
is-
most of it.
This is a big subject that we could probably talk about all afternoon because it's really the foundation of rebuilding relationships.
And we'll hang around for the after party if you guys are doing that.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. Yep,
So
we'll be there.
for those of us who've been around forever, everybody knows that we have the after party afterwards. For everybody who's interested, we stop the recording, stop going live, and then we open it up for everybody. Let's go ahead and do that now. Just kind of stop everything.